This is the Mind Body Detox podcast, where we discuss all things integrative health and wellness, interviewing folks from all over the world, sharing insights and wisdom for how to live a healthier life in mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back, everyone, to the Mind Body Detox podcast. I am your host, Mind Body Medium Kara Lovehart, and we are here another episode where we're going to interview someone who has the background of a psychotherapist, but has ventured into the spiritual aspect and the nature of us as human beings. So I'm so excited today. We're going to be introducing you to Sarah Johnson. She is a therapist, a shamanic healer, a relationship intuitive, and the author of Sacred and Exhausted: How to Understand Your Child, Move Past Fear, and Parent with Ease. Sarah began her healing journey after years of struggling with substance abuse, depression, and anxiety, and her healing experiences led her from traditional psychotherapy to alternative forms of healing to discover herself and her life's work. And Sarah has guided thousands of individuals to connect with themselves and heal their relationships. So these are the people we bring on the show, guys, the people who have gone through their own journeys, who have walked the talk, who have gone to those dark spaces. And those are usually the people who have really been shining their light, not only on this show, but in the world at this time. They were making a big impact. So I'm really excited to bring Sarah on. And we're going to dive into some really awesome questions and go in here for you guys to learn a little bit more about her and her background. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Kara. Thanks for having me on. I'm very excited to be here.
Yay, wonderful. Well, we actually met at an event, and I had a couple of my friends said, you need to go over and meet this woman. And when I meet someone who has a psychotherapy background, they're also venturing in or have been introduced to or are deep into spiritual nature, shamanic culture, whatever the healing aspect things, and they're also grounded, like your energy is, I get very excited because there is this nice balance between being very intuitive and getting tapped into spirit, and then also being grounded and anchored and having boundaries and professionalism. So I was like, oh, wow. So we connected and we decided to do a podcast together. So I'm curious in general, like, because we didn't actually get to talk about this, but when you were, just being, a counselor, a psychotherapist, what was the segue to journeying into becoming a shamanic healer and the intuitive piece? Like what opened the door for you?
Good question. So I did, I worked in a lot of different areas. I worked a lot of different settings with a lot of different types of populations. And I ended up in a private practice where I just got burned out. And so I stepped away from therapy. I kind of thought, therapy wasn't super effective. I was looking for other ways to help people. But also I was in a place where I was not very helpful. And I knew that at the time too. So I stepped away for a little bit. I did some community-based therapy when I did come back a little bit, but still frequently looking for alternatives. I found that some things were helpful and some things just felt like there had to be more. So I started to get into some alternative things that are just different than traditional psychotherapy that have become more common now, but back then weren't. So energy psychology was one of them, like muscle testing and tapping. I started to get into that. And I was always kind of interested in shamanism, but I was a little intimidated by it. So I got back into private practice again, started doing some healing work that way. And then again, just felt that like, well, what's the spiritual element of this issue? Like there's something else going on other than what I have the information about. And that's what moved me into shamanism. Finally, I was brave enough to step into it and ultimately feel super happy and glad that I did, because that's exactly what I was looking for. I was looking for that extra piece.
Yeah, there's so much more behind the intellectual knowledge or the academic understanding of psychology and even just the physiology of how the brain and the nervous system works. I feel like that piece, when you start touching into the energy piece, the beyond the physical realm, that there's so much to unpack. And I'm really stoked that now, 10 years after I've been doing this work, that this is something that people are now interested in. It doesn't seem as scary. We have still this just kind of like process that we're going through that I'd love to kind of ask you about with the word shaman, with this potential use of it that's empowering, a potential use of it that's disempowering and appropriating different cultural uses of that term. But I'd love to hear your perspective on how you adopted that term. How do you respect it and how do you honor it? And what does it mean for you?
Yeah, so that's something I've thought a lot about. It's something that in the course that I took, the training that I took, there's a lot of respect around that. There's definitely a high understanding that it is appropriation. You know, I am not a shaman. A shaman is somebody who was chosen by their community to be the healer of the community. And I wasn't raised in a culture that has those practices. The program that I went to, we talked a lot about honoring and respecting where you come from. So my specific lineage of shamanism comes from Mexico. It's actually Chiapas, Mexico. It's from Maya people. And so there is an understanding that I was gifted this. This was passed down. And there's just such a high respect for that, for the ancestors, for the knowledge, from even the way that it got to me, from my teacher, from my teacher's teacher, who learned from and lived with the indigenous tribe that actually this form of shamanism comes from. Um, so it is something that is appropriated. I have a lot of respect for it. Um, the terminology is tricky because I think it's something I play around with. Like, do I practice shamanism? Am I a shaman? Am I a shamanic practitioner? Um, and it's something that I've kind of settled into, that I follow things from shamanic cultures, that I
Yeah.
implement skills and, um, again, gifts that are used in these cultures that, with permission from all of my teachers, were taught to me.
Yeah. So if you had to speak to someone who does no idea what some of the practices are from shamanic traditions, and there's so many different all over the world, right? What are some of the tools that are used that can be simplified for someone to say, okay, that is a shamanic tradition or tool or modality, or if you want to call it that?
So it has to do a lot with relationships. So one of the big, and keep in mind also that shamanism is taught so differently,
Yes.
significant differences. So the way that I was taught was that when we go into a shamanic journey, um, I'm just leading you into your answers. So in other shamanic practices, they do the journey for you and come back and bring the answers back to you. So this is also there. It gets a little complicated as far as like what form of shamanism you're talking about. So the way I was taught, the big thing is about relationships. So if we're thinking about traditional cultures or tribes or villages that had shamans, often they were the person that checked on the harmony of the group. They were the person that lived on the outside of town. They were the one who said, what is not in harmony here? So it hasn't rained, you know, our crops aren't growing. We as a people are out of harmony. And so that's where I like to pull from, is when I specifically when I work with people too, is where is the disharmony? And I feel like that's
Yeah.
my specific medicine that I'm supposed to work with people on. Uh, so that would be one thing, is looking at the relationship and where the disharmony is. Another thing is animism. So just
Mm.
seeing everything as having a soul. So things that are a little easier to see that have a soul are things like plants and trees. But then it's more than that. It's ideas, it's concepts, it's our home, it's our vehicles, it's everything. So I like to pull that in too.
I love that. I think that my understanding of shamanism from my own journey as a seer has been the ability to, you could say, walk between worlds, but being able to be grounded and anchored into the physical reality of what is presented in front of you, but also see underlying patterns and structures that are happening in psychology, in the spiritual aspect of things, in the energy, and you said the animism. You know, when you have that sense, and it's something that can be developed. It's something that people have more skill set for, but it can still, that's why they would choose the shaman. Like, that person has the gift, and they would take them in and they would mentor them. And I think that that gift is something that or that skill set is something that a lot of people are growing. And whether or not they call themselves a shaman or not, it's how I think it's how it's used. But it is this perception of reality that everything does have an energetic signature, whether you call it a soul, an entity, a thought form. And I think if you understand how those things work, how they operate, how they interact with things, like seeing the imbalances in the disharmony inside in the tribe, in the group, that's what I always am looking at. In how can we find harmony in from a global collective, looking at the big picture, and then zooming back into everything's a reflection of that big picture. Each individual has to make a shift. So I'm curious, along your journey, this a lot of these things, when people find their healing work, it is going through these dark parts of themselves, these challenges. You had challenges with substances, and you had challenges with the depression, anxiety. I find that people who are inclined to have shamanic or spiritual gifts tend to go through a part of their journey that they could say that in our culture they struggle with some sort of mental health diagnoses. And there is that fine line between that psychosis, that actually going through your own stuff and doing the work, and actually having this spiritual awareness. So I'd love to hear your journey a little bit more and how you navigate it, if you care to share some of that.
Sure. So I think a lot of this starts in childhood, right? And a lot of the um, coping skills that get developed in childhood and then go into when I was in college. And so that's where, when I look back at it now, that's where I really started to see was in college a lot of the intensity of anxiety and depression and then alcohol abuse. Because although there were some signs when I was in high school, it wasn't something that was like readily talked about. It wasn't something that was discussed a lot, like, oh, this is anxiety. Um, and so I felt that I was just kind of shy. I just felt I was just like, I really was terrified of people. Like when it comes down to it, I was absolutely terrified of people. So I had a nice friend group in high school, though, so it didn't seem so obvious. And then getting taken out of that into a setting where I didn't have close relationships, it became, again, in hindsight, very apparent that that's what was happening. And so in college, it was a really struggle. It was a real struggle with the alcohol use because it's normalized. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I look back on it, I think a lot of people were drinking for fun. I think I was drinking for escape. And
Yeah.
it became like, how often can we escape? And just the absolute fear of being seen, really, to being seen in any
Mm-hmm.
capacity, being judged, to the point where I wouldn't talk, like just wouldn't talk to anyone in my classes. I wouldn't talk to my teachers, wouldn't talk to, the other people beside me. I would just talk to a few people. And to the point where I was struggling academically and wouldn't ask for help because I didn't know how to, I didn't know what was happening. And so from going from that to then I found in my senior year, I was going to go into nursing. I knew I wanted to help people. I drank too much and was going to parties and prioritizing that too much that I ended up not being able to have the grades to go into nursing. So I had to do a plan B. And I found, well, I didn't find it. My parents sat me down and said, you have to graduate in 4 years. What are you going to do? And we found that I could still graduate in 4 years with a psychology degree. And so in my senior year, I was in a some kind of career class, and I found art therapy. And so I just it really lit me up, the idea that I could help people, and I just loved art. It was something that felt very safe to me. It was a way to express myself, and so I don't know that I would have gone into the helping professions, therapy specifically, because at the time I would have, like, I'm not in a position to help people, especially mentally. But
Yeah.
because of the art piece, that really like pulled me in. And so looking back now, I'm really thankful that that's really the only reason why I'm here, is that pull in and that love for art that I was able to get into art therapy first. And that was really the stepping stone of, I had a really good program that I went to. Seton Hill University has an amazing art therapy program where the teachers actually worked with you personally. So there's a lot of healing and growth within that. I had a lot of opportunity to actually like look back at the previous years and see kind of what was happening and what was unfolding. So that was kind of the first step. But then I still went through a lot of years of struggle. And didn't really, I went through a lot of therapists. Um, I didn't do any, I would say, like alternative methods at that time. It was all just therapy. We were told to be therapists, you should have therapy. So
Yeah.
did that. And then ultimately, I had a situation that happened where I kind of just did a self inventory and said, like, um, the person I am now is different than the person I was 3 years. I had been drinking a significant amount, several nights a week, would call into work late. I worked with kids as a therapist, and the shame of that became so great that there was a split moment where I called off from work, and I felt, because had been up drinking until 3 in the morning, and couldn't get it together to get to work. And so the shame of that, I was just like, had to take inventory of myself, of like, who am I really to help people if I'm still engaging in all these behaviors?
Yeah. That's amazing. That's a turning point. I feel like that's a turning point that I always know that the universe life has those moments that are kind of ready for people. They're ripe when they're ripe. And so many in the healing profession, that wounded healer archetype that doesn't recognize consciously that they are, they're called to help because they've been wounded or whatever it is, that there's a lot of unconscious driving of some of these healing professional modalities and people in the driver's seat, even of psychotherapy, where there is, and it's challenging because when you're trying to find, when you start to decide you really want to do your own healing and you made that decision, I'm excited to hear what happened next, because usually that's when like it really starts to get real.
Well, and so the path has really been, though, looking at all the external things I have used to feel well internally. And I'm still working on that. There's still levels that I'm uncovering. But it does go through, like, so what's the anxiety about? What's the depression about? How am I self-medicating in one way or the other? And it could be with substances, it could be with food, it could be with relationships, it could be with sex, it could be any of these things.
Yes.
And so it became a awareness that um, my life had really uh, gotten to a point where I had to undo all these things that I had thought were helpful. So the first thing I did was the tapping. That was majorly healing for me. I was able to, as they say, collapse a significant, childhood traumas, sexual trauma, things that had stuck with me for a long time. And so that was my first, like, this is not therapy. It was also something I did with somebody, but it was also something then I did with myself, and also felt the relief that came just from having that tool for myself also.
Yeah. I love how much the research is now coming out on how much trauma, yes, needs to be worded, it needs to be labeled, it needs to be identified so that we can name it, so we can identify how sometimes to process or just give a word to the emotion we were feeling during that time, and then somatically working it out through all these different ways. And even the aspect of art therapy as a tool too, like, because that's such a beautiful space that you're in this kind of altered state in a way. If you get in that flow state and you're creating almost from that unconscious, you're bringing it out onto a piece of paper. I just finally feel that we're moving in this direction, that as we continue to provide resources like this to share with people, that their efficacy, and people are starting to get these tools that they've been needing. So yeah, go on.
Yeah, and I agree with exactly what you're saying. And the thing that I think is very fascinating is that there's so many tools,
Yeah.
and it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
And I encourage everyone to find the thing that fits. And so I've been through multiple things. One of the things I have on my Instagram is I have a PDF that you can get for free. It's like 70 plus pages of all the modalities I'm familiar with, and there's like a brief description. It talks about the pricing of it, where you can find it, and it's because some therapy isn't for people. Some people, I have clients who have a spouse who's just not interested. You know, They would rather not do that. And it is intimidating. And so I created this list to be like, well, just do anything, work with oils, work with essential oils, or go to a craniosacral therapist, or go to a shaman, or just our world needs well people.
Mm-hmm.
And so just starting something that's the least intimidating thing, just start there. So I like to pass that resource on too. And then for me, I think it's just been an ongoing, learning each step, right? So it's managing anxiety was probably the first thing I really tackled, was to looking at like where this comes from, you know,
Yeah.
coupling it with like some of the cognitive behavioral therapy things that are in traditional therapy, like where are these thoughts coming from?
Yeah.
And then just moving, and then new things come up all the time.
Yeah.
And the universe has a way of being like, here's your next thing.
Yes.
And so just honoring that and being okay with that too, I think. I know I went through a time where I was like, are you serious? Are we still doing this? We're still giving me things to heal. But I've come to terms that that's how it is. And so, yeah, there's just new things always coming up. And sometimes the thing you're doing is effective, and sometimes you need to switch it up and move to something else.
Yeah, the thing that my partner said a while back was really profound. It was a metaphor. He said, when lessons come up, it's kind of like jump rope. The first time the rope comes around, you're like, oh, crap, I didn't jump. And the next time it comes around, you get better. And it's not like it goes away. It's just like every time then you meet that person that you weren't able to in the past have a boundary with or whatever. It's like, oh, I know how to jump this. And then you're able to interact with a substance or person or challenge in a way that you're just jumping rope, you're double dutching. You're like, fine. But then something new comes along, or it comes in a different angle that you're like, oh, wait. And I think that's the beauty of life. I think life has these challenges and these opportunities for growth that when we lean into them, it's so rewarding. It's I think the best part of being a healer, if you identify as that word, I know a lot of people don't like that word, but I say, if you're healing yourself, if you're on a healing journey, you're a healer. You're here to work on yourself. And when you do that, you inadvertently, or through mentorship, or through going in this line of work, or even just through example, you're helping others to heal as well. So yeah. And now also, if you have children, you're modeling for them. And so I'd love to kind of lead into that, because children, you were working with children, and now you have your own, and you wrote your book. So let's talk a little bit about kids. What is your worldview like, from knowing how much trauma we have, and in actively that things are still perpetuating that, and then if we're doing our own healing, what is your idea on raising children, when you have your own healing journey and in the world today?
Yeah, so I wrote this book because what I find when I see clients is there's certain areas that people are out of alignment with. And so what I want to do is just focus on each one of those areas. And so the first one is with children. I thought it was super helpful for me writing it, for my clients as well. One of the things that moms would often tell me was, I'm just so terrified of traumatizing my child. So they were very aware. Often they have their own history of trauma. They don't want to do the same things that their parents did to them, but there's such anxiety around it. And so I wrote this book to help with that anxiety. And the way that made the most sense to me was to ask questions. And then I did a shamanic journey to then get the answer for that question. So I specifically asked, like, what do kids actually need from their parents? What do they need from their friends and their community, from their own hearts and their bodies? And so the book itself is meant to just answer those questions, to have a guide for people. And so to calm some of our anxieties as parents, to say, like, what's actually needed here. And what I found was the biggest thing that kids actually need is they need to explore this world. And unfortunately for us, exploration doesn't always look so nice.
Yeah.
Exploration is messy. It looks like defiance sometimes. It looks like tantrums. It looks like big emotions, but it's all exploration. And then they need to be connected to a safe adult where they can they can share what they found in their exploration. And so that's really what the book is about. And then also what I like people to know is that your job and your goal as a parent can just be as simple as that. How do we look at things in a different mindset so we don't get personally offended? And then also, how do we be there in a place that's calm and supportive and safe to then help them kind of navigate what they've experienced.
Yeah. You're embarking on, being a parent, or you become a parent, it is very much like just a doorway for entry point into understanding your inner child or your inner teenager, even deeper, because then you're confronted with a reflection of it, and that maybe it looks like you even. And so I think there's a lot of things that that people can, like you said, like they don't want to traumatize their own child. They get their own stuff that comes up. And I found my own, I have a 17-year-old. How many children do you have?
I have one 5-year-old.
Okay, so yeah, he's at this age now where it is about, I've always let him explore, but it's now about letting him explore and make the decisions, and like really just go, you do it. You do it, but I'm still going to have boundaries with you. I'm still going to, treat you this way because this is how it is. This is a safe container. And that's really something I think that he's really flourished because of that ability to explore. And I love that you shared that, because one of the other things, he's very sensitive. So if we would have, like, I know a lot of people talk about their children being sensitive, especially if they're also shamanic in nature or intuitive in nature, and he is as well. So raising a child that has a sensitive nervous system like that is also interesting, because you don't want to give them a complex and be like, oh, by the way, are you experiencing these things, like, and so watching him has been really beautiful, to him finding his own anchor. So I'm kind of thinking about that and just curious, you know, with your childhood growing up and having all your journey, particularly for your own unique experiences, do you feel that part of that primed you to have a nervous system that was more destined to work in the shamanic realm?
Absolutely. And I think we're all kind of that. We should look at our childhoods and look at how they've gotten us to where we are now, in positive ways, in ways that maybe we should look at a little deeper. So I write this in the book, but I did not feel connected as a child. My parents had divorced. I primarily lived with one parent and would visit the other. It didn't feel safe to connect with either one of them because it would offend the other. And so I just stayed kind of safe in the middle to myself. And that's where like the anxiety, just not wanting to be seen came from, because it was safety. It was my way of staying safe. And so when I've worked with my inner parts, so that's another big part of shamanism and shamanic journeying, is you're connecting with those parts. And so there's not just one inner child. There's 60, there's 100, there's infinite amounts of parts of you that have experienced things and that need a little help processing it. So when I look at my childhood, I didn't have that person. I didn't have the person I could say like, hey, mom is this way or dad is this way, like what's going on? And someone to be neutral and say like, this is what's happening. What do you think about it? And I loved how you talked about your son, of cultivating the ability, even from a very young age, of what do you think about this?
Yes.
Do you have an impression of what this is? Does this make sense to you in this way or that way? And then, of course, you can input your information, but allowing them to lead with what they think is happening, intuitively what they think is happening, because kids are so good at that. Even if they don't fully understand like the big concepts, they have a sense that when someone talks to them in a certain tone and they're saying nice things, but the tone is harsh, like they know.
Yeah.
And it's very confusing when someone tries to say like, no, you don't know. I'm saying nice things.
Yes.
No, you're using a tone.
Yeah.
So yeah. And I talk about that too, just a way of like, so us as adults is being very congruent, and healing the things that we need to heal. And I've had the privilege of working with a ton of folks, inner ones. And it's very similar things that kids needed, that they needed as children at that time. They're 3-year-olds, they're 5-year-olds, they're 8-year-olds. And it most often comes down to somebody needed to say something to them to make them understand what was going on.
Yes.
And it wasn't there. And so they came up with their own ideas. And when you come up with your own ideas as a child, you're the problem.
Yes.
You must be, because that's the only thing you have.
Yeah. That's so interesting, because my son always said, why does everyone talk to me like I'm a baby? Why does everyone, use that baby tone? Or when adults come up to you like, oh, look how cute you are. And, he's like, why? And he would get very upset and he goes, I don't like you. And he'd just be very like, you just run away. He's like, he's very fiery. And he was like, no. And I had some people say, there's definitely content that you want to share or not share with your child that's appropriate for their age development. But we were very honest and like direct with him, like, this is what, you're perceiving, or this is what's going on. And I think that helped him. He in his high school years, I think he's been able to now see, like you said, when someone is not being honest or authentic or truthful, or something else is going on, it's not gaslighting them and be like, oh, you don't really know. Because I think a lot of us as adults have given up that inner voice, that inner intuition that is innate there as a child. We give it up because we're like, well, we're supposed to, this is saying this. And it all starts in those teenage years. So
Absolutely. And that's one of the biggest things I feel in the past couple of years is can I trust my own view and intuition and thoughts? And that's been huge. It's one of those things that you can't heal when you're 23, because you just don't have the other building blocks to even get to that point. And so that's what I'm trying to foster now is trust yourself. Like, so people will say things because that's okay. They have their own stuff that they're doing. They have their own stuff that they need to heal, their own things that they're trying to figure out. And so you, above all people, can trust yourself. And I think that that's like the biggest gift you can give a kid, is to trust yourself.
absolutely. I completely agree. That's the most empowering thing that I hope for any person out there that's doing healing work in this world in any capacity, that helping people to point signs and directional, like, to, you're a facilitator, helping them to come to their own conclusions. Because I think that's the best thing, that if all of a sudden tomorrow everyone had their lights turned on in a way where they had this direct connection with their own intuition, their own source, whatever they want to call it, they want to call it a higher power, whatever it is, that knowing that truth, I think that things would be a lot different. And that's an idealistic world, right? But people would be living more in their purpose. They'd be able to ask questions, and then of course still reach out when they, get connected, and you get biased sometimes when you're too emotionally attached to things. But it would be a very different world if we had that type of empowerment going on. Well, what have you learned as a parent that you wish you would have learned or known years ago?
There's this thing that happens um, where you disconnect from things that seem like a threat or seem hard or harmful. And so if you come from a history of trauma, like I have, many of us have, one of the skills is to disconnect. And we do this with everything. It's not just our relationship with our children; it's relationship with our spouses, our relationship with our parents, with our friends, our community. And so that's the biggest thing, is learning how to see something that's challenging and not emotionally disconnect from it, to not retreat and go back into a place of fear and potentially there's other emotions within there. And it doesn't, I'm not saying it like we have to be so loving all the time, because that's not what it looks like. But it's an understanding that you're safe even when people are doing things or saying things that you don't like. And so it's that understanding that my wellness, my heart, my soul, my worthiness is all okay, even when I have a 5-year-old having a tantrum in the middle of the store.
Yes. I think that the emotional constipation, if I want to call it that, which is a lot of times the inability to express deep emotion, anger, fear, sadness, that I think is what drives all these types of behaviors that are avoidance. Like you said, like it could be, alcohol, it could be substances, it could be sex, whatever it is. And I think if we were given permission when we were younger to feel those emotions and shown and modeled in a healthy way, because a lot of us, even myself, part of my journey is my son. I feel like I've been born in this world with from the brethren family, the ancestors in which I come from, that didn't have the ability to express deep emotion. There wasn't time, and there was survival needs. There was, I live in a home that we have 5 generations of people that lived in the same home, and they all were women who were widowed. There's so much, as a medium, so much of the grief that I processed for them, consciously and unconsciously. But when it became consciously, it was so beautiful, to be like, okay, this is a thing. And I think a lot of people get very uncomfortable. And there's definitely a time and space when you can express your own emotions and showing to a child what it can look like in a healthy way. And what I was challenged with when my son was younger was, I was like, let's yes, it's okay to be angry. But then when he would go out into public, because he's an intense, he has like this Leo energy where he's big. And that big energy, other adults who have not done their own healing work, especially in daycares and schools. You're shaking your head. Holy cow. That makes it's actually a trigger for them, for their own inner stuff. And what's been very fascinating and somewhat challenging as a parent of being aware of this, going, he gets shut down in school and like, this is not healthy. And he's trying his best and he's actually doing a really good job. And everyone else is the one that are, emotionally constipated and they're not aware. So I'm curious if how you dealt with that, or the challenges with that, with having a 5-year-old and having, I'm sure, other adults who aren't as aware and have gone through some of their own journey. How you've dealt with that?
Right. One of the big things for me is just holding two things as truth. There's nothing wrong with my son. And
Yes.
I just want to make sure that people do that with their own children. There's nothing wrong with them. Part of the work that I did prior to going back into private practice is I worked in community based therapy in people's homes. And so these children had conduct disorder, they had oppositional defiant disorder. And I saw a lot of common themes. And one of the common themes was at around 5 years old, they started to have defiant behavior. And the parent never really stopped talking about that defiant behavior. They never really stopped talking about what was wrong with their child. And so even then at 15, there's something wrong with my child. And I just imagine what that does to their inner ones, to their parts. And so I want to make sure that, again, there is something that happens at 5. There's some brain development that goes into, executive functioning. You're getting out of, the hindbrain into the midbrain where there's big emotions. And so it is a challenging time, but that's because their brain's developing. Like it's totally age appropriate. It totally makes sense. So I'm very cautious about how I talk about things, that he is well and good and kind and all of these things.
But well, I think that you're on a roll here with validating that they're absolutely fine. There's the diagnoses is necessary for insurance purposes only,
Correct.
folks.
Yes.
It's really important to remember that, even for your own. Like, some people are
Yeah.
like, oh
Agreed.
my gosh, I finally had this diagnosis. Now I know that I have ADHD. It's so validating for me. This is what's quote unquote wrong with me. And I always caution people, like, that's some symptoms, but doesn't mean it can't go away with healing. Because we talked about this in other episodes, but I just think that complex that you can get as an adult or a child with these disorder type labels, they're just a conglomeration of symptoms. Until you go into school, you're like, the DSM is a joke to a lot of people in the psychology field. They don't know that.
And it's an easy way to describe something. So instead of listing off these 12 symptoms, I just say this one word. Yeah. So it's not an identity. It's not something that has to stick forever, because the symptoms are just a product of the struggle of the things that need to be healed. And so that's all that's there too.
And I think I always find it really fascinating when you dive into, there's so many different modalities, but one of the modalities that has been kind of foundational for the self-help personal development field, especially Hay House Publishing, was Louise Hay's book, You Can Heal Your Life, which is kind of based out of cognitive behavioral therapy. You're looking at your thought patterns and replacing them. And, she says that the core belief that we all carry is that we're not enough, that we're not lovable, that some form of not enoughness is kind of in all of us. And we got to do our work already, to overcome those unconscious beliefs that is true, versus these ones that are being labeled by doctors.
Right. And so that's the other thing that I lost there for a second that came back. I try really hard to choose him over other people. And so to choose his, and I by no means let my child be unruly or disrespectful. However, if someone is going to say something about him as a human, I'm going to protect that, and at all costs.
Yeah.
That he is not labeled in some way, that he is not made to be smaller from what you call the emotional diarrhea, or like the trigger that some adult is going through that they don't fully understand, that it's just their trigger. Like, I'm going to help him understand that he doesn't have to compromise or sacrifice himself for that person's comfort. Because I know that we've all probably been in those situations as children.
And it's not going away as an adult either. As an adult, we still will interact with people who have been triggered by us or project onto us, or there's something going on that if we have more awareness of ourselves and anchoring and tethering to who we are, we can still be kind and considerate and have boundaries, but it teaches them to not, the four agreements is so much how I love the four agreements. It's just how we lead, how we run our clinic. And it's like, don't make assumptions, don't take things personally. And that's so important, because if you can hold on to that, you are so much better off. Yeah. Well, what tips do you have for parents, or those who do have children in their lives, whether they're an aunt or an uncle, or they just have a brief interaction with the children in general?
Yeah. So that's why I like this book too. So just to give this kind of like backstory is, so this book was all created from shamanic journeying, and so I really see it as its own thing. Like, again, we're talking about animism; it's its own thing. And so sometimes I talk about it's not my book; it's its own thing. So when I say like I love this book, that's why I say that. Um, it's because it is meant for the aunts and the uncles and the grandparents. So one of the things, my parents read the book, and one of the things they both said was it helped them know what kids are needing for their grandkids. And so
Yeah.
the thing is really those safe, secure people. So it's less about like all the lessons that you're teaching, which are helpful in some ways, but it's really about the connection. It's really about, do I feel safe and secure with this person? And the safe and secure comes with, when I say something, kids are watching. Like, is it okay to say this thing? Like, is it not okay? Are you going to judge it? Are you going to tell me that I'm wrong?
Yeah.
And so there's a safe way to do that as a parent or as a family member, to encourage kids' own ideas and not stamp them down all the time. So in the book we talk a little bit about like some of the things that we accidentally do to decrease worthiness.
Hmm.
So this is one that's a little bit like might get some pushback on this, but one of the things that it looks to me is that pairing behaviors with consequences and rewards. That's a
Hmm.
big that's a big thing that
Mhm.
it takes away. Just there's research that says it takes away their internal motivation. So there is just evidence of that, but it also then pairs good and bad.
Yeah.
When you have a tantrum in the store, that's bad, and then you get something removed versus um, something happened. So finding out what happened,
Yeah.
what was the cause of the big tantrum, what was going on that led you to this point, and really validating the emotions. And particularly if you have young ones, it's very irrational. That's where their brains are.
Yeah, but if you're helping them through that process as their brain's developing, and they can identify and become self-aware through the process of asking questions of what happened, instead of shaming them more, pushing down that emotion more, helping them to find, well, you know what, that I can see why you were upset and had that at the grocery store. How are you feeling now? In the grocery store, in the future, do we have any other ways we could do that or express that would be like, that would feel even better to you, because that did that feel very good, like that might be, like I could, oh gosh, I see, now I want to have another child. I have one, and I'm like, man, these are the things that I you grow up with this. I'm growing up with this child. I was 21 when I had my kid, so I was not prepared. We're not most of us are not prepared, and there's so many of us that think like, oh my gosh, if I could go back and do that. But I definitely think that the resource you're offering, especially from the lens of it becoming into the world, it became into the world as a shamanic piece that came through you. I think that is so beautiful. I think especially because you have the background and the understanding, even just the academics of the foundation, then to allow it to animate itself into a more fuller expression of how we can really support these children and ourselves being parents. So yeah. Well, I'm curious if there's anything else you want to share about your book, or if you want to go into talking about what it looks like to work with you.
Like I said, I think it's important for it's super short. And I did that intentionally because I have some attention issues. I don't particularly like to get caught up in the fluff of things. And so it's meant to be something you can read very quickly and then implement things very quickly. And right. So it's something you can hand to your, if you have your own clients and they're like, I'm not really sure what to do with this parent or with this child. It's also meant for people who, like, I love learning, but not everyone does. And so it's also meant for those people too, where they can just flip to a page and be like, what's the deal with friends? What's the deal with parents? What's the deal with like these emotions, and just have it. It's very quick and easy to. It's also very easy to understand because, again, as someone who's neurodivergent and has been in a lot of education and most of the time had no idea what was happening, I wanted to make sure it was very easy to understand also. And then as far as working with me, that just goes back to finding my medicine. And for the people that want to work with me, is finding the disharmony. So sometimes that looks like a relationship with a person, but often it's actually a relationship with a concept. So a concept like power and safety, with health and wellness. Money is a big one that comes up. And so it's really looking at, okay, well, how would it actually feel for you to live in this world and just feel safe? Like how would it feel for you to actually feel powerful when you go into places? And then there's usually something there that's just not quite in alignment. And so we work on that. I use shamanic healing, but then I also use internal family systems. So that's the part of therapy that I can actually use insurance for and actually go down that route. And actually, it's IFS is so similar to the shamanic work that I was taught. Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know that for those of you, like when she's sharing about this foundational thing, you're talking about safety and how the concept of money can relate to safety, the concept of, community, all these things relate to safety. I honestly feel like that's such a foundation for so many things because that grows the safety and value, like valuing yourself and safety. I feel like those are two foundational things. Because if you value yourself and you truly do, and you feel value, see value, you can embody feeling valued. Even if you didn't ever have it, you can grow it. You will develop boundaries. You develop self-care. You will develop better relationships with others because you're developing that relationship with yourself. But that sense of safety is so big. I think especially for people who have gone through trauma, but in our world today, it doesn't feel safe even now. So like even for a lot of people, like how do you rectify that? And it's like all the parts. Like how does your child feel safe? Your inner teenager is going to get mad. Usually it gets more feisty and fiery if it doesn't feel safe and it wants to change things. And I think we have a lot of us in our world today, we're not always maybe productive or efficient with creating actual safety in our world. We're more so operating out of reactivity, versus constructively developing boundaries, rules, regulations, organizations, even healthy and safe community containers. Such a big thing. And it's such a, it's part of my healing journey of not having that safety and community, and especially in the holistic realm where we have a lot of misuse of power and weird power dynamics. So for me, it's like not only part of my healing journey, and I'm very aware of it, passionate about it. Obviously, it's if it's a trigger, it's a healer. It's a healer if it's a trigger, and if it's a trigger and there's passion and motivation behind it, it for me it creates this strong boundaries and wanting to create safety for others because that creates safety for me within the container that I'm helping my own person, my own child, all the parts. So I love that you named that as the foundational thing. Can I ask you a question actually about that? About working with people with the safety and the money stuff, the community stuff that you shared about. What are some of the outcomes after working with people? What shifts in their lives when they change their relationship with the concept of safety? I'd love to share that just for people to know more and identify if they are in this boat. Here are symptoms you might experience or life circumstances or experiences that are commonly there. And then after going through this is what can shift.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind for that. So the first thing is a lot of times people actually won't go to any kind of therapy or healing because they don't want to change the situation that they're in. So like they don't want to leave, let's say like a spouse or a partner, or they feel like they maybe have to cut somebody off. There's a lot of fears about like, if I'm this, what that's going to look like. And I found in my own healing work that that's not always the case, because really you're changing the relationship with yourself. And then things seem less threatening around you. A lot of the people that I work, it's actually a perceived threat. It's not a real threat. And I think that's super important for people to recognize. There's a huge difference there. The emotional threat and what's emotionally abusive versus if you're looking at something that seems like a threat. And so really getting a better understanding of what that actually looks like. What I've found is that most of the really difficult emotions, the ones that tend to have like a lot of energy around them, but they're also discomfort. There's a lot of discomfort around them, like the anger. There's also like the anxiety, the ones that feel, if you feel into them, they're very fast moving. They're like, we have to do
Yes.
something now.
Oh,
Um,
yes. Yes,
yeah,
I know.
they have the fight, flight, freeze is the
Yes.
response to them.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you really look at them and you really start to think about like where they come from, they're often from a lie that we're telling ourselves, typically about ourselves. And so if you have a situation when you're in conflict with somebody, like for instance, I was talking to someone the other day in like a group forum. It was a group myself and the other person was running, and everyone was asking for feedback. And the feedback I gave to the other person running the group, they had a reaction to it. They had a little bit of like, I maybe hit a little bit too close than they were comfortable for. So immediately I go into, oh my gosh, I'm the worst. Like, I can't believe I just did that. Like, I'm a bad friend, all these things. Well, so then all that energy comes up.
Yes.
And so immediately to calm that, I can say, like, none of those things are true about me. I'm actually very conscientious of people. Had no idea that it would have hit like that. There wasn't something I did intentionally. I am a good friend. I am all these things. And all of that dissipates. And so a lot of, what I'm looking for with people is, what are those stories? What are those narratives that we've created? So the thing about safety, like when you get in an argument with somebody and then all of a sudden you're like, I'm not safe. And so the external thing doesn't actually have to change. The messaging to yourself has to change. So
Yes.
you become safe. You feel safe in situations, even when there is conflict, even when there
Yes.
is discord. Yeah.
Yes. That's profound. And because then if you can change that, you won't have I would say as much of a struggle for the emotional regulation when you're in these situations, because that's half the battle. Actually, that's a lot of the battle for people. And learning, okay, when you get past a certain level of heightened activity, then you either go cry, you get angry, you become apathetic, whatever people's mode of fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, whatever they do. And I think when you hit that threshold, it's like, oh my gosh. And then you're like, crap, I'm in the cycle again. So it's like sometimes we're going at it. I think there's so many different angles to go about healing, and they all are so relevant. They'll all teach you something about yourself. But when you find that one thing, you can shift that, like you said, that's profound, because then you can put your energy into other things that are important. So yeah, yeah, wonderful. Well, there's anything else you want to share about your work, about what it looks like to work with you, or your book, or anything at all?
Well, folks can find me on Instagram. I just wanted to share that. So I'm at Sarah is a Healer, and on Facebook, same, Sarah is a Healer. And the book is on Amazon. It's called Scared and Exhausted. It's how to understand your child, move past fear, and parent with ease. And the point is that parenting is not easy, but when you feel like you can stay regulated and help your child when they need help, that's where the ease comes from.
Yeah.
And so that's really what I want to help people with, is how do you find ease in things? How do you find ease in conflict? How do you find ease in, just relationships with everything? So even things like, the earth and some of these relationships aren't things that people typically seek help for, but I want to encourage people like to think about their relationship with safety, to think about their relationship with sex, to think about their relationship with God. That's a big
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The biggest things that we have a potential misuse of power, I think, are the biggest things that are scary. That's why religion, politics, sex, money, those are the big four, because those are power. And if we can take back our power and feel comfortable in the driver's seat of those things within our individual self, other people that are misusing it do not trigger us anymore. They're just like a nuisance still. And it's still that, there's still people out there that are working on changing misuse and putting up structures and boundaries, because that's what we're kind of going through, I think, in a big picture collectively. We're taking our power back. Like, that's my if you want to call it shamanic viewpoint, but that's the collective view of like, how do we take our power back? It's recognizing when we're not using it, or where we've given it away, or where the shadow, we're not aware of something to be able to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And those are the core beliefs that they talk about in therapy. It's the responsibility, it's value, it's safety, and then it's power. And so those, like, responsibility is a big one too. Like, we take too much ownership of something, and then we go into ourselves, and we get smaller. We lose our power. And so all those things really are, again, what are your relationships with those things, And it doesn't even have to be, and I guess I just want to encourage people too, that a lot of these works, these healing modalities, sometimes you don't ever have to talk about the thing. And I guess I really want to push that for people. Like, you don't have to talk about the trauma. You can talk about the idea. You can talk about the concept. You can talk about the emotions behind it. You can never even say the thing. And so I want to make sure that people understand that too, because it just feels important that people still seek out help, even if they're like, I don't want to talk about that thing. Like, that's fine. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely important, because this is what we're here to do. Like, my part of my journey, and I know, for what you're sharing, that sounds like part of your journey, is how do we help people get the help they need? And because there's so much stigma, and the stigma is like, oh, I have to go and talk about it. And that's too scary. That's too overwhelming for the nervous system. And that is not necessary. Like you're saying, it's so beautiful. And maybe not all people in the professional psychotherapy setting have that belief or viewpoint or training. So it's important to know that you may encounter that, and that doesn't make it right or wrong. It makes it one path and may not be right for you.
Yeah. And let me just add on that too, because again, in that PDF I have, just about all the healing modalities. One of the things I have in the front of it is just helping you gather like a couple of thoughts about what you would like to work on, and how to get clarity on where you are now and where you would like to be. But one of the things I mentioned in there is it's our job as healers to make you feel comfortable and safe enough to explore those things. And yes, there is some discomfort in that, but it's in a comfortable container. There has to be trust. And so if you're with somebody, any type of a professional or healer that you don't feel safe with, bring that up to them. And if it's not corrected, then move on. And I think that goes back to what you're saying, is they're not all equal. And so it's important for, I guess I'm pushing power into people in this moment of be okay with something else if you don't feel safe. That's the number one priority of all of us. And if it's not, then find someone who does have that priority.
I love that, bringing up the fact that if you don't feel safe, if you do go through expressing that, because it is a point of vulnerability, and you see that someone's true colors, or they're not able to meet you there, then it's obviously a move on, But if they are, that is profoundly even deeper of a recipe or ingredients to create deeper trust. When you can lean in and share something that was vulnerable and challenging, and they go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. How can we fix this container for you?
And we welcome that as healers and professionals. We want you to say that. Yeah. And we want to help that.
Well, because some people are worried, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to offend them. And
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And most of, even if they present that they're not, it's still, the heart is usually there of, oh my gosh, let me shift this for you. That's beautiful. Well, thank you, Sarah. I love this. This was so good.
Thank you so much.
I am very excited to have this episode go live and everyone to listen in. But again, everyone, if you have any other questions, if you want to work with Sarah, learn more about her, all of her information is in the show notes. If you have any questions, again, if you love this episode, if you want to learn more about this stuff, again, keep sending us your topics. Give us a review. You can leave a review for this podcast. It really helps the podcast be seen so that people can see it. It is a relevant and quality podcast. But other than that, guys, we appreciate you all listening and tuning in, and be well till next time, my friends. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Mind Body Detox podcast. If you love this podcast, share it with others and leave us a review. Your reviews help us more than you know and supports us continuing to make episodes and being heard from all over the world. You can also follow the link in our show notes to submit a topic that you would like to hear on the show.